hardy on because the session being as hot as the last session. And I'd like to introduce John Rees. He is a Counterfire member and also the author of Strategies and Tactics. We're selling it there, and in light of all the discussions today, and especially this session, I urge you to go and spend your pennies and buy it. John will kick off.
As they say. Okay, so one of the most frequently rehearsed arguments about the possibility of a revolution in the modern world is that they don't happen any longer. May have happened in 17th century England, may have happened in 18th century France, but really they're a thing of the past. And I just want to recall for a moment, or just to place before you, the fact that actually revolutions are quite frequent events. And I'll talk a little bit, therefore, about some recent experiences of revolution. And then in the second half of the talk, I'm going to move on to talk about the kind of logical case, if you like, the analytical case for revolution, about what the structure of our society is like and why it's liable to continue producing revolutions and what part we can play in that. So there'll be a kind of historical section that I'm going to deal with, and then a bit of analytical argument, which for those of you who are keen on Hegel is, I think, one of the things that Marx learned from Hegel. You move between the structural limits and possibilities of the system and the historical experience of people trying to change the system. So for the first part of this, let's just remind ourselves of some absolutely huge revolutionary experiences in the modern world. Here, the first slide, a little bit indistinct, but there's armed militias in the Spanish Revolution in 1936. It's a terrific revolutionary experience. If you've never read anything else about revolution, I urge you to read George Orwell's Homage to Catalonia. Even the first pages of his experience in that revolution tell you exactly, and written by a master of the language, what the experience of the working class being in power in Barcelona in 1936 was like. If you want to see some of the dilemmas that arise, in particular the dilemma that the critical juncture which arrives in every modern revolution about whether or not it will simply get rid of the old order and institute a kind of more democratic version of the society that we already have, a more democratic state, or whether there's the possibility of the working class seizing power. This was the central debate of the Spanish Revolution. It's described very clearly by Orwell, but it's also described brilliantly by Ken Loach in the film Land and Freedom about the Spanish Revolution. So many of the things that we've talked about today are dramatized and presented, well, by two masters of their craft, really, in that case. This is Portugal in 1974, Western country emerging from a fascist dictatorship. In this revolution, one of the questions that was asked earlier is, what do you do about the armed forces? Well, in the Portuguese Revolution, as I would argue in any revolution that's going to be successful, it's unlikely that you and I, or people like us, are going to be able to take on the armed forces and defeat them in open battle. But what happens in a revolution, characteristically what happens in a revolution, is that the social upheaval is so great that it affects the armed forces as well. And in the Portuguese Revolution, practically the entirety of the armed forces developed its own revolutionary movement, the Armed Forces Movement, which was absolutely central to the success of the revolution as far as it got. And of course that was also true in the Russian Revolution as well. The soldiers came over to the side of the revolutionaries, and that's why the workers' councils weren't just called workers' councils, they were called councils of workers, peasants and soldiers, because the soldiers were directly electing their own representatives and sat as part of those democratic bodies. This is Poland. The rise of Solidarity in 1981, which was the beginning, really, the indispensable beginning of the collapse of the Stalinist dictatorships in Eastern Europe. A huge workers' movement centred originally on the Gdansk shipyards, involving actually some intellectuals as well who'd been long-term oppositionists, anti-Stalinist revolutionaries who played a part in that revolution. And it was the rise of that workers' movement, the huge strikes and shipyard occupations that eventually broke the will both of the Polish government, even though it suppressed solidarity in the early 1980s. It couldn't hold it down. It won elections late in the 1980s. It made it clear, therefore, to the Russians that simply crushing this movement, as they'd done in earlier East European revolutions, wasn't a possibility, and opened up the whole path that led to the 1989 revolutions throughout Europe, resulting in the fall of the Berlin Wall. Of course, we've all gone through a huge revolutionary experience in the Arab revolutions that began in Tunisia in December 2010. The most important of those revolutions, the revolution in Egypt in January 2011. And this illustrates another point about revolutions. Not all of them and all of the time, but certainly in the East European cases and in the Arab revolutions, as in the revolutions that Marx and Engels fought in 1848 in Europe, there can be, under certain circumstances, a domino effect. It's really impossible to imagine that the Yemeni uprising that partially got rid of the Salah regime, or the original outbreak of the Libyan and Syrian revolutions, would have happened if they hadn't been preceded by Tunisia and by Egypt. And I've already described the way in which there was an international dynamic to the East European revolutions of 1989. There was an international dynamic that followed from the Russian revolution, because after that revolution there was revolution in Hungary, in Germany, the 2 Red Years in Italy. In fact, as one European statesman said, Europe is alight with revolution from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Mediterranean in the south. And so when we're talking about how revolutions can overcome national limitation, one of the essential features of them are that they're infectious, or can be infectious under certain circumstances. Finally, a couple of points about the West, because people say, okay, you know, you can, by the way, this list is far from exhaustive. I've missed out the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, the Czechoslovak Revolution of 1968, the Iranian Revolution of 1979, practically the entirety of the anti-colonial revolutions which Faizi was talking about in the preceding discussion. And they're not limited to places where the system is weak. I mean, obviously, weaker forms of capitalism, weaker states are more prone to revolution, but that's by no means their exclusive site of where they're located. Germany in 1918, at the beginning of the revolutionary experience that lasted until 1923, was one of, if not the most advanced industrial countries in the world. France in 1968, which didn't result in a revolution in the sense that it overthrew even the existing government, but was, and still is, by the way, the largest ever general strike in European history, which led to enormous amounts of barricade fighting, that the de Gaulle, French president, was helicoptered out of the country at one point because he thought that the state was so near to collapse. So wherever we look, and I would say in Greece today, although it's not a revolution, I would say the preconditions of revolution are beginning to accumulate. Lenin once famously said that a revolution happens when the old order can no longer go on ruling in the old way, and the working class refuse to be ruled in the old way. And I would say that elements of that situation are accumulating in Greece now. There is such a huge social and economic crisis, now a complete rupture in the old governmental parties, the complete collapse This is critical of the old reformist party PASOK and its replacement by a more radical but still parliamentary opposition in the form of Syriza, the product itself of extra parliamentary mass movements, of 32 general strikes in the last half a dozen years. What happens next, and this is an important part of everything I want to say, will determine how that develops. It has some of the potentials of a revolutionary situation, but potential and political crisis aren't enough. It then depends how the different political actors, the different social forces, the different classes within such a crisis develop. A couple of things I want to make about that. First points I want to make about that. First of all, every revolution is not simply an event. You know, we refer to them afterwards as the Russian Revolution or the Portuguese Revolution, but they are all processes. Sometimes enormously compacted in time. You know, Lenin again said that there are events that in normal circumstances would take decades to work out, happen in a matter of weeks in a revolution. What a revolution does is to concertina, to contract the time in which absolutely huge events take place, that whole social forces and political classes, whole governments come to power, can be brought down again, replaced by others. The shift in allegiance of whole social classes can change in a matter of weeks, can happen in a matter of weeks and months. So the consciousness and the kinds of organisation that are dominant in the initial phases of a revolution are very unlikely to be the ideas, organisations that dominate at the end of a revolutionary process. What happens during the process, who says what to whom, who organises how, what demands are advanced, how judgments are made about the governments and the other political forces by the actors in the course of the revolution will determine its shape. So it's quite frequent that revolutions open with a kind of nationalist consciousness or a consciousness which wants more democracy. This was Lenin's point about national revolutions. When the Easter Rising took place in 1916 in Ireland, many people in the socialist movement said, oh, it's just a nationalist rising, oh, it's just an anti-colonial rising, how can you take this seriously? And Lenin's reply to those people was, those who wish to see a pure revolution will never live to experience one. They always start off with ideas which fall far short of the idea that working people have to completely take hold of the old system, dismantle it and replace it with their own rule. That's something which is learnt by experience in the course of a revolution. In the course of a revolution, as Trotsky put it, the working class comes to consciousness by the mechanism of successive approximations. In other words, it puts its faith in one strategy, in one organisation, like the provisional government in Russia. That seemed to fail, to be inadequate. It carries on the old order, it carries on the war, and consciousness and political allegiance change to people who were much more marginal, perhaps at the beginning of the revolution, but now chime much more completely with the aspirations, the deepest aspirations of people who want to change the society. Here's another thing. What the other side does in a revolution matters. In particular, what the counter-revolution does in a revolution matters. You see, you can look, Venezuela is actually only has a revolutionary aspect because of what the counter-revolution did. Chavez comes to power. There is a level of popular mobilization, but the real popular mobilization comes when the capitalist class and the old state machine kidnap him from the presidential palace, attempt a counter-revolution, and then there's an absolutely huge popular mobilization which forces the ruling class to release Chavez, to bring him back to the presidential palace. And so in a way, the Venezuelan revolution is a product of a mobilization to defeat a counter-revolutionary thrust. In a way, the October Revolution in Russia only happened because the General Kornilov, assisted by the provisional government, attempted to crush the Bolsheviks and to mount a counter-revolution against the February Revolution, and this deepened the revolutionary process, transferred allegiance from the provisional government to the Bolsheviks and the Soviets, and that's what opened up the path to the revolution. So it's a dynamic process. It's not like the siege of a medieval castle. They just sit there, we bring up the scaling ladders, we run up, no, we are in movement, but they are in movement as well. We have strategic goals, they have strategic goals. They're thinking about how to defeat us, and it's that dynamism, that interaction between the counter-revolutionary forces and the forces of the revolution, which actually clarify what the revolutionary tasks are, what must be done in order to defeat them. And that's as much I want to say actually about the process, the kind of historical process of revolution, and to point out some of the things which are common about it. That there has to be a deep social crisis, there has to be mass mobilization, that mass mobilization will enter a revolutionary period with ideas and with organizational allegiances which will change in the process of revolution, and the way in which the ruling class is reacting, is trying to mount a counter-revolution, will change those situations. When revolutions fail, they fail because the political leadership among the revolutionaries is incapable of dealing with that, and they very frequently fail. One way of looking at the defeat of the Egyptian revolution is this, that the provisional government that it put in power, the Morsi government, thought it could coexist with the system, thought it could introduce parliamentary democracy, and that it would be allowed the space to do that by the old order, by the military, by the capitalists and so forth and so on. Exactly the same thought actually that the provisional government in Russia had after the February 1917 revolution. It therefore did not prepare, was not willing to, did not have the political understanding to think that it should prepare people for dealing with the counter-revolution. And when it came, it was bloody and final, and the restoration of the old order is, if anything, more severe than it was even under Mubarak. So when people talk about the cost of revolution, what we also need to think is, what is the cost of counter-revolution? And the cost of counter-revolution is nearly always more bloody, more long-lasting, more disastrous than the cost of a successful revolution. All right, so much for the kind of historical elements of it. So I want to turn now to some analytical arguments about why a revolutionary process like this is necessary. I mean, it would be nice to think, and many people obviously who want, even among those who want fundamental change in the way of the system, think this is all very risky, and there are risks involved, no doubt about that, that it's difficult, and there's no doubt about that it's often unsuccessful. That is also true. I want to make some arguments about all those points notwithstanding, why it is really the only possible way of fundamentally transforming the system. And to start with, I just want to start with this idea that Karl Marx had in the German ideology, where he says, a revolution is necessary, therefore, not only because the ruling class cannot be overthrown in any other way, but also because the class overthrowing it can only in a revolution succeed in ridding itself of all the muck of ages and become fitted to found society anew. So let's just deal with the first part of that the society cannot be changed in any other way. Now, the traditional alternative to a revolution, of course, is to try and change the system piece by piece. This is what Labour and social democratic parties, reformist parties, have tried to do ever since they arose as a mass formation with the Social Democratic Party in Germany at the end of the 19th century. The historical experience, if anything, is that this is absolutely and fundamentally not possible. The old Christian socialist R.H. Tawney put it like this. He said, you can skin an onion, skin by skin, but you can't skin a tiger, claw by claw. And the system is a tiger. It resists fundamental social change. It unseats governments that try to do it. It undermines them. It uses its economic power to undermine democracy in the system. And no attempt, I'm not saying that, I don't prefer, in electoral terms, a reformist government or a Labour government to a Tory government, stands to reason. But in terms, if the project is to fundamentally transform the system, the record of reforming it and hoping that gradually, piece by piece, we'll arrive at some different state where working people have control of the society, that has been historically simply impossible to achieve in any circumstances. The second point is actually the more interesting point, really, and it's this: that it's only by going through the enormous kind of cultural, intellectual, moral transformation that a revolution achieves that working people will be able to challenge all the muck of ages, the racism, the xenophobia, the sexism, the snobbishness, the competition that inhabits the society, which shapes our personalities. It's only in the experience of collective action, of banding together, of forming collective institutions, of defending trade unions, of building workers' councils. This is a transformatory experience for the individuals who go through it, and it allows them to leap in part from the way in which they view the society, atomized, set against one another, competitive, discriminatory, to be able to found a society anew. That doesn't happen when you vote Labour at an election. That only happens as part of a mass transformatory experience. So we can say, if all other methods have failed, if the reformist method has failed, if for the reasons that Faisy gave in the last talk, the idea of socialism from above, of Stalinism, of you simply have a government which nationalises the means of production, and this is somehow socialism. I mean, I object to this theory simply on the basis that the two states most associated with it, Stalinist Russia and Maoist China, both killed 20 million people. I don't really see that any socialist can conceivably conduct an argument on the basis, I want to draw a model from societies which industrially murdered their population, including vast numbers of socialists and trade unionists. So this is an unappealing, shall we say, model for social change. So the two dominant models, apart from the revolutionary model, the reformist model and the Stalinist model, are historical failures. And I tend, when faced with that kind of historical experience, grand historical experience, to rely on the great Marxist Sherlock Holmes. That once you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, must be the truth. And while it's the case that reformism has decisively failed to produce a socialist society, and while it's the case that Stalinism and its variants have done that, the question of revolution is still open. On at least one occasion it has done so, in many occasions it has raised the possibility. That historical possibility remains open, and it's therefore, if you like, by process of elimination, the one which is the most attractive. And that kind of socialism from below, as we call it, revolutionary socialism, is very, very important tradition, because it points us to the way in which we can become an active part of bringing about the thing that we want. If it's a process that happens during a revolution, it's also a process that precedes a revolution. That certain forms of activity now will bring us further towards that, and certain forms of activity now will carry us further away from that. Lenin put it this way, he said, the capitalists could always solve the crisis so long as the workers are willing to pay the price. And the price can be very high. In the 30s, the price was European fascism for solving the crisis of the 1930s. But I want to look at it in this way. Insofar as in the present, we prevent them from doing those things, it blocks off the options for the ruling class. If we say no to austerity, they have to think again. And it, in a sense, deepens the social crisis because they can't solve it at our expense. If we defeat the fascist option, that means they have to think again, and we limit the possibilities of the ruling class in terms of solving the crisis. And since the system is unable to deliver for us, it brings closer a possibility of the solution that we want, of mass action, of politicization, of controlling the society for ourselves. In other words, we enter into the chain of causation. It isn't something that we're just waiting for. It isn't something that's just coming at the end of the day if we're patient or when the crisis is big enough. By acting now in certain ways, we limit the field of operation for our opponents, and therefore we bring the possibilities, the organisation, the consciousness that can make a revolution closer than it is at the moment. In other words, we're not observers of a social process, we're participants in it, and we can shape its direction and shape its alternatives and shape the options that open up before us. So just to conclude, I'll put the argument about revolution perhaps in a slightly different way. This is Blaise Pascal, French philosopher, 17th century, and he famously made a kind of, he was actually a Catholic himself, but he made a kind of atheist argument for belief in God. It's called Pascal's wager. And he said, the argument was this, that even if there's only a 1% chance that God exists, nevertheless, rational people should choose to believe as if he did. Because he said, you're balancing the possibility of eternal redemption and eternal life in heaven against something where you don't lose anyway. If you're right, if it is the 1 out of every 99%, well, you're made. But if it isn't, then at least you're living your life in a way which will make you happiest and make the people around you happiest. So even if you don't believe in God, you should act as if you do believe in God, because this is the best way to conduct your life. Now, I don't want to argue about religion at all. I have actually, as far as religion itself is concerned, I have this man's view, Pierre Laplace, who, when he was describing the movement of the planets to the Emperor Napoleon, Napoleon said to him, thank you for your explanation, but I don't see the place for God in your system. And he replied, I had no need of that hypothesis. But let's look at Pascal's wager in another way, a way it actually is used in a marvellous French film called My Night with Maud. But let's not talk about God. Let's talk about if this is not a wager. Pascal's wager is not a wager about God, but it's a wager about revolution. That if we are right and a revolutionary possibility exists, then everything we do has meaning and possibility. But even if it doesn't, we are doing the right thing in the present. It's a way of keeping you honest. It's a way of saying that you're going to advance social causes, that you're going to be able to play a role in constructing a better society, even if we're wrong about the end possibility. Now, that's always seemed to me a very powerful idea, but there's one way in which it differs from a wager on God, and that is, if we behave in this way, we alter the terms of the bet. You see, if you bet on horses or the existence of God, you can't alter it. You're making a judgment, you're making a wager, but you can't alter the outcome. The brilliant thing about this wager is, if you wager on revolution and act as if it's possible and make changes to the current struggle which make it more likely rather than less likely, you're altering the terms of the bet. You're altering the possibilities. It's going down from 99 to 1 to 90 to 10 to 80 to 20. You're altering the terms on which the bet takes place. And therefore every struggle that we do in the present, every judgment that we make, every action that we carry out increases the possibility of working people being able to transform the society. If you join a union, you make the possibilities of the ruling class exploiting the working class less, and you make the chances of liberation greater. If you join an anti-war movement, or if you join a people's movement against austerity, you're limiting the chances that the ruling class have of getting their way and altering the chances that we have of being able to defeat them. Crucially, if you're part of an organisation like Day-Counterfire, which is active in all these ways, which is thinking about the structure of society, analysing the way it's working, active in all these movements, you're making a contribution towards the possibility of human liberation and away from the destruction that counter-revolution or austerity or fascism will wreak on society unless that possibility is opened up. And that possibility, I suppose, there's one version of it, William Blake's drawing of the New Jerusalem. So if we want a New Jerusalem, if we think that's a historical possibility, if we think that the alternatives haven't worked, The point is to transform the world now, because that affects the possibilities in the future.
Thank you, John. You know the form. You've got quite a lot of time to ask questions, discuss, and I've got hands up already. I echo what Dan was saying, let's keep it snappy. Would you like to start there? Yeah.
Thanks, John, for that talk.
We'll take Alistair after maybe John comes back on that. And also, just one more thing. I got an eye blur. Did I see an arm? No. Can I have some more, more arms though, please?
Okay. Well, I agree about the point about the red herrings and what. I mean, in fact, I agree about any kind of Deus ex machina, any kind of argument that we don't have to do the work, that it's inevitably going to become a possibility because of social development. No, social development creates possibilities, and there are always, in any given social circumstance, more than one possible outcome. That's why I think the Lenin quote is so important, that the capitalist can always solve the crisis as long as the working class is willing to pay the price. There is no crisis so deep that if we aren't willing to pay a high enough price, the system can't stagger on. It will never collapse simply because of its own contradictions. It will only create the possibilities for us to end it because of its own contradictions. And whatever those arguments are, I always dismiss them. They're under-theorized. It's not that the elements that they point to aren't true. Of course, it's very difficult to think about a revolution where there hasn't been a huge social and economic crisis, but a huge social and economic crisis or a war or any huge social cataclysm won't produce a successful revolutionary outcome on its own. That requires direct intervention, organized political intervention to make that possibility, rather than various other forms of counter-revolutionary or reactionary possibility happen. I think the advantage that we have, I think there's one absolute barrier to too much kind of post-revolutionary planning, and that is we never know the exact circumstances under which the revolution is going to take place, the exact threats that we'll meet, the level of solidarity that will be delivered, how international it will be, how isolated it will be. There are too many unknowns in that equation to give sensible answers. But we do have one form of advantage that previous revolutionaries didn't have, and that is their experience. Lenin couldn't debate what happened in the first, well, he could debate what happened in the Paris Commune, which was the first workers' state, but he couldn't really debate what was good and what was bad and what was a mistake and what was positive out of the first European Socialist Revolution, because he was in the first European Socialist Revolution. So the only thing that defeats give you is more experience on which to make judgments. We know that the internal corrosion and the emergence of a new ruling class from inside an isolated revolution is a possibility. That's what Stalinism was. We know that is a possibility in a way that Lenin couldn't possibly have conceived it, because it only happened after he died. So the only virtue of more failed revolutions is that the revolutionaries today have more experience and are therefore sensitized to more possibilities than we were in the past. But it won't save us, because it's always every new experience is always partly a continuity of the past and partly something absolutely different from the past as well, and our experience won't be different than that. As I say, the lucky thing is that at least we have some experience. Imagine what it was like for the English revolutionaries in the 17th century. In the entire human history up until that point, kings and czars and Caesars and Kaisers had only ever lost their lives in battle or by assassination. Nobody had ever put a king on trial for treason to his own people. They did that for the very first time. And no wonder they thought that the millennium had arrived, that shortly there would be the second coming of Christ. That's what many of them thought. At least we have more experience to make the judgments from.
So Alistair, and then fellow at the back, yeah.
Oh, I thought I was going to come Anyway, it's not so much a question as a comment. And it goes back to what the first comment you spoke that said, and it's about this idea about whether socialist support reforms. I think it's absolutely correct. Socialists really support reforms. They're all steps that strengthen their movement. We're also where reformist parties like Labour Party exist. We are actually in favour of them coming to power. We want them to go into government.